welcome to another episode of Board Game Review with Jason. This is a video podcast where I take a board game, show you how to play it, give you my personal review, and then give you some decision points so you can decide if it's a game you would like to check out. In this episode we're looking at a game called Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle is a game designed by Ananda Gupta and Jason Matthews for 2 players. It was originally published in 2005 by GMT Games. Since then, there's been a deluxe edition published with a mounted map board, better graphics, and a few other small changes. It is out of print right now, but if this game turns out to be one that looks like something you would be interested in, it is scheduled to be reprinted within the next couple of months, so you should be able to pick it up soon. Twilight Struggle is a game about the Cold War, which was primarily a political struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union between the years of 1945 and 1989. Some people classify this as a war game, but it's not a war game in the sense that you're moving miniatures around the board, conducting a lot of military combat operations to gain area control. There is an element of area control in the game, but it's more about managing a hand of cards, playing those cards in such a way to spread your influence throughout the regions and countries, and playing special cards so that you gain victory points at the most opportune time, and the one who gets the most victory points wins. If you're at all familiar with Jason Matthews' other politically themed games such as Campaign Manager 2008 or 1960 The Making of the President, both of which I've covered in previous episodes of Board Game Review with Jason, if you're familiar with those games, then you'll feel right at home with this game because it brings a lot of the mechanics from those 2 games into one big epic game. It really is the granddaddy of these games. It is the #1 ranked board game on Board Game Geek right now, and so it's highly regarded by a lot of people and highly recommended by a lot of people if you're at all interested in the Cold War or these card-driven type games. It'll take you about 3 hours to play and cost about $60. So let's open up this box and see what's inside. So here's what comes with a game of Twilight Struggle. You get a bunch of counters for each side, blue and white for the United States and red and white for the Soviet Union. And these counters are just simple denominations of various influence points, so like 3 points and 4 points of influence. One side's darker and one side's lighter. We'll see how that comes into play later. Each side also gets a die in their color. And then you have a set of markers that are used for things such as tracking victory points or a turn marker or other things such as reminding you when certain special things happen during the game. And then you get a rule book which is pretty well done. It is in full color. It is standard wargame fare though, where each rule is numbered and there's a lot of cross references to rules. But it's fairly well written, pretty easy to understand. There's also some various variants talked about, and then there's an example given at the end of the rules, as well as card histories giving you some historical background about all of the cards throughout the Cold War, as well as some designer notes. And then you get a bunch of cards, which is really the heart of the game, and finally you get a fairly large map board. So let's open up this map board and take a look at it. So here you have the map board for Twilight Struggle, and you'll see that the map is divided into 6 regions denoted by different colors. So you have Asia in an orange, you have Africa in a tan, the Middle East in a light blue, Europe in a purple, Central America in a light green, and South America in a dark green. And each region has these regional scoring reference charts, which we'll get to later. Some regions are divided into sub-regions denoted with different shades of the same color. For example, in Europe you have Western Europe with the darker purple and Eastern Europe with the lighter purple. 2 of the countries in Europe, Finland and Austria, have both shades. So for the purpose of this game, they're considered to be both in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. The other region which has a sub-region is Asia, and the sub-region is Southeast Asia, and the countries in Southeast Asia are denoted by the countries that have two colors of orangish yellow color. And we'll see the importance of these two sub-regions later on, but just for now know that within Europe and Asia there are sub-regions, which is a subset of countries. Also note that the regions these countries are in are not truly geographic. So for the purposes of this game, for example, Libya and Egypt are considered to be part of the Middle East, and Turkey and Canada are considered to be part of Europe. You also have the two superpower spaces, one for the USA and one for the USSR. So one player will be the United States, the other one will be the Soviet Union. Another thing to note is that these country boxes are connected by various lines. Some lines are black, which means they're connected within the same region. Other lines are a dotted red, which means they're connected between two different regions. But however they're connected, if they're connected by a line, then for the purposes of this game they're considered adjacent. And that will be important later when I talk about influence. So taking a closer look at one of these country boxes, let's take a look at Israel. Each of these boxes represents either a country or a politically connected group of countries. So you might have like the Gulf states as a box here. But looking at Israel, this is very similar to all the other boxes. You have a representative flag, you have the name of the country or block of countries, then you have a number which is known as the stability number, and then you have two spaces here where you'll be putting influence markers. For example, during the game the United States may gain 4 influence in Israel. An important concept to grasp early on is the notion of controlling a country. You control a country if you have a number of influence in the country that's at least the stability number. So the stability number for Israel is 4, and I have at least 4 in there, so I control influence in Israel, so that's why I put the influence marker on the dark side. But the USSR could also come in here and place its own influence in Israel. And another condition for having control of a country is that not only must you have influence at least the stability number, but you must have at least that stability number plus your opponent's influence number. So the United States would have to have at least 4 plus 3 or 7 influence in Israel now to control Israel. So since the United States no longer controls Israel, I would put the marker with the lighter side up. In this way it's easy to see that if it was just the United States that had influence there, that I know I control Israel because the darker side is up, and it's easy to see that. So again, in order to control a country, the number of influence you have in that country must be at least the stability number and at least the stability number plus your opponent's influence in the country. So currently in Israel, the USSR has 3 points of influence. They don't control it, so the lighter side is up. So if the United States were trying to come in here and spread their influence into Israel and control Israel, they would have to put at least 4 plus 3 or 7 influence in order to control Israel, and their marker is on the darker side. If they were only managed to put 6 influence, they could still do so, but they don't control it yet because it's not at least the stability number plus your opponent's influence. The other important thing to note about these country boxes is that some countries have their name banner in purple, while others have the name banner background color in tan. The purple colored background means that it's a battleground country and it's going to have special importance throughout the game, while the tan background colored banners means it's just a normal country. But we'll get to the importance of battleground countries a little bit later. In the upper right hand corner of the map board we have the turn record track, and so overall the game is going to have at most 10 turns grouped into the early war, the mid-war, and the late war. And then within each turn you're going to have a number of things that go on. So you have the action round track, which will track each of the action rounds within each turn. Underneath the turn record track you have the space race track, So during the game you're going to have opportunities to advance in the space race and gain victory points and special abilities during the game. You also have a DEFCON status track, which is going to track the nuclear tension throughout the game, and it ranges from a DEFCON status of 5, which is peace, all the way to a DEFCON status of 1, which is nuclear war. Throughout the game you're also going to be required to conduct a number of military operations, and so you have a track to keep track of how many of those you have done. You also have the victory point track, and this is where you're going to keep track of how many victory points each side has. And you're actually going to have just one marker that fluctuates between more points for the United States, and then when the USSR gains points, it'll just come back towards the USSR. So this will keep going back and forth, and one of the goals of the game is to try to get enough victory points to get either to down here to the 20 points for a US victory or 20 points for a USSR victory. And finally you have a sequence of play reference chart right on the map board which will guide you through the flow of play. But before we get to that and setup, let's take a closer look at the cards. So you'll make 3 decks of cards with the cards that come with the game: an early war, mid-war, and late war card deck. The top banner of the cards tell you which deck they go in. You have an ID number at the top, which you can use as a cross-reference into the rule book if you just want to get some background details on the card, the event on the card, and what historical significance it had. And then in the top left corner of the card you have an operations point value, and this number is in a star that's either all white, which means it's associated with the United States and mainly beneficial to the United States for the event, or in all red, which means the event is mainly beneficial to the USSR, or into a split white and red star, which means the event is beneficial for both sides, depending on who plays it. But you have the operational point value in the star, and then you have the event name and an event description, what happens in the game when you play the card as an event. So each player is going to have hands of these cards, and you're either going to play them for the operational points value or for the event. Some cards have an asterisk next to the event name, and this means that when this card is played for this event, that this card is going to go out of the game completely. So you can only play this event one time during the whole game. Other events are underlined, which means that they remain in play for the rest of the game until they are canceled or otherwise removed. So most of the cards in the game are going to look like this and have these characteristics. There are 2 special kinds of cards in the game, and the first is a scoring card. So for example, this is the Middle East scoring card, and this is when you're going to have a chance to score one of the regions and gain victory points based on your influence in that region. The other type of special card is the China card, and we'll get to that later on. So to set up the game, you're going to take all the cards and find all of the early war cards, and you're just going to start the game with this deck of cards, the early war cards, and you're going to find the China card and give it to the Soviet Union player, and then you're going to deal each player 8 cards. The remainder of the cards will become a draw deck. Then the USSR player places their starting influence. They place 3 in East Germany, and note the stability number is 3, so they do start out controlling East Germany, so that's why the dark side is up. They put 1 in Finland. Finland is 4, so they don't control it yet. They put 1 in Syria, which they don't control, and 1 in Iraq, which they don't control. And finally they put 3 in North Korea, and they do start out controlling North Korea. Then the USSR player gets a free choice within Eastern Europe of where to place 6 more influence. And you can do this in any combination. So for example, they may place 3 in Poland to start out controlling Poland with a stability number of 3, and 3 maybe in Austria. Note that Austria is both in Western and Eastern, so it is valid to place it there. So they place the other 3 there. They don't start out controlling it. Then the U.S. places their starting influence: 2 in Canada, 1 in Panama, 5 in the UK, 1 in Israel, 1 in Iran, 1 in South Africa, 1 in South Korea, 1 in Japan, 1 in the Philippines, and 4 in Australia. Then the United States can put any combination of 7 influence anywhere in Western Europe. So they may decide to put 4 in West Germany, 2 in Italy, and the last one in France. Each player also has a space race track marker, so you put both of those on the start space of the space race track. Then there's a DEFCON status marker. The game starts at level 5, which is peace. Each player has a required military operations marker, which they'll place on 0 to start the game. Then you place the victory point marker on the 0 space of the victory point track. Finally, you place the turn marker on turn 1 early war on the turn record track, and you're ready to play the game. So the overall game is guided by this turn record track. There will be at most 10 turns in a game of Twilight Struggle, but it's likely your game will end before the 10th turn. The 10 turns are grouped into 3 turns of early war, 4 turns of mid-war, and 3 turns of late war. When you start the game, the first 3 turns you're going to be in the early war, and you're only going to be playing with the early war deck of cards. From this deck you're going to be drawing the cards for your player hands and playing them to form a discard pile. At some point during the early war, the draw pile is going to be depleted, and so you'll shuffle the discard pile to form a new draw pile and continue drawing cards from that into your player hands. At the beginning of the 4th turn you enter the mid-war, and you'll take the mid-war deck and shuffle it into the draw deck. So in the mid-war you're playing with any remaining early war cards and mid-war cards. And then at the beginning of the 8th turn, similarly you're going to shuffle in the late war deck into the draw pile, and you'll start playing with all of the cards. So what happens in a turn? The sequence of play of what happens in a turn is printed right on the map. So let's just go through each of these in more detail. The first thing you're going to do in a turn is increase the DEFCON status. The game starts at DEFCON status 5, which is the highest level, so you won't increase it at the beginning of the game, but during the game the DEFCON status level is going to change. So at the start of every turn, if you're not at DEFCON status 5, you're going to increase it by a level of 1. The second thing you do in a turn is deal cards. We've already done that in game setup for turn 1, but during turn 1 you're going to be playing cards from your hand, and you'll have some number of cards left in your hand at the end of the turn, usually 1. So in turn 2 you're going to draw your hand size back up to 8 cards. So each turn of the early war you're going to start with 8 cards in your hand. Then when you get to mid-war, when you draw cards, you're going to draw up to a hand size of 9. So from turn 4 onwards you're going to be playing with 9 cards in your hand at the start of each turn. Now remember, in game setup, the USSR also had a China card given to them face up. This card is going to change hands between the players during the game, and whoever has the China card, that doesn't count against your hand size. So whoever owns the China card is going to have their normal hand size of 8 or 9 plus the China card. The third step in a turn is the headline phase. So during the headline phase, each player is going to look through their hand of cards and select one to play as an event. So the USSR player may decide he's going to play that one, and the USA player may decide he's going to play that one. Then both cards are revealed. Now remember, the color of the star reminds you which side the event is beneficial for. So during the headline phase, you're likely to be playing, the USSR player is likely to be playing a red star card, while the US player is likely to play a white star card. It is possible that in your hand of cards you may not have any cards that have events that are beneficial for you. But you must play a headline card as an event, regardless if you have one that benefits you or not. You can play a scoring card during the headline event, but it has an ops value of 0 during the headline event. And whoever owns the China card, they cannot play the China card as part of the headline event. But once both players have revealed their headline event cards, you're going to compare the ops value of both cards. And whichever is higher goes first. If there's a tie, then the US player will go first. So in this case, the card played by the US player has a higher ops value, so the US player is going to go first in the headline phase and play the event on this card. The US player has headlined with the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact event, which says that the US gains sufficient influence in Japan for control, and the USSR player may no longer make coup or realignment rolls in Japan. We'll talk about coup and realignment rolls later, but you already know about gaining influence for control. So here's Japan with a stability number of 4. There's 1 US influence there and no USSR influence there. So how many more US influence markers do I get to place in Japan in order to bring it up to where the United States controls Japan? If you answered 3, then you're correct. So playing this headline event card lets me add 3 influence to Japan. So I can just put a 4 influence marker in Japan, and I put it dark side up because I now have control of Japan. This event is underlined, so that means it's going to remain in effect for the rest of the game. And that pertains to the second part where USSR may no longer make coup or realignment rolls in Japan for the rest of the game. But we'll talk about what coup and realignment rolls are a bit later. Now the USSR player plays his headline event card, which is Nasser, which says to add 2 USSR influence in Egypt and remove half rounded up of the US influence in Egypt. So USSR gets to add 2 influence in Egypt, and the stability number is 2, so I have control of Egypt, and there's no US influence there, so none is removed. Note that this event has an asterisk beside it, so since it was played as an event, this card is removed from the game entirely and doesn't go back into the discard pile to be potentially played again. So the fourth thing you do in a turn are the action rounds. So after the headline event phase, each player is going to have 7 cards remaining in their hand in the early war and 8 cards remaining from the mid-war on. In the early war, you're going to go through 6 action rounds, and then from the mid-war on, you're going to go through 7 action rounds. There is an 8th action round space here because it is possible through an event or other special action that you can gain an extra action round in a turn. So the USSR player is always going to start first in action round 1 and play a card from their hand, either for the ops value or play the event. And then the United States player is going to take their turn and similarly play a card either for the ops point or the event. Then you're going to go to action round 2, and the USSR player plays a card. Then the US player plays a card. And you keep going in a similar fashion through 6 action rounds in the early war and 7 in the mid and late war. So after the US player has played in the last action round of the turn, each player is normally going to have 1 card remaining. You may have more cards or you may have no cards left at all due to certain events where you have to discard cards, etc. Any cards you have remaining in your hand, you can hold on to them to be played in future turns. And then in the deal cards phase of the next turn, you'll draw your hand size back up to 8 or 9 cards depending on if you're in the early war, mid-war, or late war. An important thing to note about cards that you have remaining, if you have a scoring card in your hand, you must play it in one of the action rounds for this turn. You can't hold a scoring card from one turn to the next. So I could not have held on to the Asia scoring card. I would have had to have played it during one of the action rounds of this turn and held on to another card. So during an action round, when you play a card, you're going to either play the card for its ops value or for the event. If you play it for the ops value and the event is associated with your opponent, For example, if I were the US player and I played this for 3 ops, the event is associated with my opponent, the USSR player, because it's a red star. In that case, the event will still happen, but the player playing the card, the US player, gets to decide whether the event takes place before or after the ops points are played. If the star is split red and white, meaning it's beneficial to either side, then the event's not triggered unless the card is played as an event. We've already seen in the headline phase how you play a card for its event. So now let's take a look at some of the ways you can use a card to play it for its ops points. So let's say I'm the US player and I decided to play this card for the ops value. So I get 4 ops points. What can I do with those 4 ops points? Well, the first thing I can do is just simply place 4 influence points on the board. But there's some rules about where you can place those influence and how much it costs. You have to place influence either in countries where you already have influence at the start of your action round, or in a country that's adjacent to where you currently have influence. So for example, I could add 2 points of influence to France because I have influence there, and bring that up to 3 influence points, and I now control it. I have 2 left, so I could place it in this Spain-Portugal, which is adjacent to a country where I had influence at the start of my action round. So I could place 2 points of influence there and control it. However, with the 2 remaining points, I could put 1 influence point into Spain-Portugal, but then I could not come and put the last point in Morocco. And that's because at the start of my action round, Morocco was not adjacent to a country where I already had influence. This rule prevents blitzing and just spreading your influence too far in one go. Now, as long as I'm adding influence into friendly countries, countries that only have my influence, it only costs 1 op point per influence point that I placed there. But when you start spreading your influence into other countries that have enemy influence, you have to be careful about the cost. For example, if I wanted to spread my influence from West Germany into Austria, Austria is adjacent to West Germany because there's a line connecting them. The USSR has 3 points of influence in there, but it doesn't control Austria. So it still only costs 1, so I could use 2 points and put 2 points of influence there like that. And I would have 2 more points I could put somewhere else. However, if I wanted to spread my influence from West Germany into East Germany, note that the USSR currently controls East Germany. So it's going to cost me more to start bringing my influence into there because it's enemy controlled. The first influence point I put here is going to cost me 2 operation points rather than 1 because it's enemy controlled. So I could spend 2 of the 4 to put 1 here. And now note that the USSR no longer controls East Germany, so it would flip the influence marker. And now further influence I may put in East Germany cost only 1 because the USSR no longer controls East Germany. So I spent 2 to come in there and put 1, and now I could spend the remaining 2 to put 2 more. And you don't have to spend all of your ops points in one place. So let's say I had spent 2 over in Europe and I have 2 remaining. I can come over here into Central America and maybe add 2 more to Panama. And you can always add influence to countries next to your superpower, so the US could spend the rest of those 2 points, say, to add 2 to Mexico. So just placing influence on the board is one way you can use your ops points for. The second way is what's called realignment rolls. Realignment rolls are used to reduce enemy influence in a country. You're not going to be able to add any of your influence in a realignment roll, but you can reduce the enemy influence. It's going to cost you 1 op point for each realignment attempt, and you don't have to spend them all in realigning one country. For example, if I played this card as the US with an ops value of 4, I get 4 realignment attempts, and I could use them all in Austria, or I could use 1 in Austria and the 3 somewhere else. So how does a realignment roll work? Well, let's say I said I want to spend my first realignment attempt in Austria. Each player is going to roll a die. So the US rolls, and then the USSR rolls, And then there are some modifiers to the roll. You get +1 for each adjacent controlled country. So if I look at Austria, the United States controls the adjacent countries of Italy and West Germany. So the U.S. currently has +2. The USSR controls the adjacent country of East Germany. So USSR gets +1. So it's a net +1 for the U.S. so far. Then each side gets +1 if they have more influence in the target country. USSR has more influence in the target country, so they get a bonus +1 to their roll. So we're back down to net of 0, or whatever the roll is. The last kind of bonus point you can get is if the target country is next to your superpower. Austria is not adjacent to either superpower, so there's no bonus points there. So it turns out that neither side gets any bonus points for this roll, so it's just whatever was rolled. So the high roller, in this case the US, gets to remove the difference between the rolls' amount of opponent influence. So the US would get to remove 1 point of USSR influence in Austria as a result of this realignment roll. Now I've only spent one of the 4 points in that realignment roll, so I have 3 more ops points to spend in realigning, so I could try it again in Austria or try again in some other country. However, I couldn't spend those 3 remaining points to place influence. You can only spend the operations points in one of these actions that I'm going through now. The third alternative you have for spending your ops points is a coup attempt. A coup represents operations just short of a war to change the composition of the country's government. You don't have to have any influence in the country you're attempting a coup in, but there must be opponent influence there. Let's say as the United States player, I wanted to spend my 4 ops points for a coup in Iraq. The way a coup works is you roll the die, then you look at the stability number of the target country. Iraq has a stability number of 3, and you multiply it by 2, so it's 6. Then you add the operations point value to your die roll, so 4 plus 6 is 10. If that number is bigger than twice the stability number, then the coup is successful. So 10 is greater than 6, the coup is successful, and I'll look at the difference. 10 minus 6 is 4, so I use those 4 points to start removing enemy influence. So 1 to remove the 1 USSR influence from Iraq, and that leaves 3, so I get to add 3 of my own influence in Iraq, and it's at the stability number, so now I control Iraq through that coup attempt. Now when you perform a coup, it's considered a military operation, so you get points in your required military operations for this turn. Since I spent 4 ops, the United States would get 4 of their required military operations. Also, because Iraq was a battleground country, its banner was in purple, and because I did a coup in a battleground country, the DEFCON drops by 1 level to 4. If I did a coup in a non-battleground country, then I would still get my required military operations, but the DEFCON level would not change. Note that there are coup and realignment restrictions based on the DEFCON level. When you're at DEFCON 5, there are no restrictions, meaning you can make coups and realignment attempts anywhere. When it drops to 4, you can no longer make coup or realignment attempts in Europe. When it drops to 3, Asia is added, so you can't make coup or realignment attempts in Europe or Asia. At level 2, the Middle East is added. So no coup or realignment attempts in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. So you always need to look at the current DEFCON status when you're thinking about doing a coup or realignment to see if you're restricted from doing that in those areas. There are certain event cards that give you what's known as a free coup roll, which allows you to do a coup in these areas even though there may be a DEFCON restriction there. But the DEFCON is still degraded if you decide to do that free coup roll. The last alternative I have for spending my ops points is trying to advance on the space race. In order to do this, I look at the next space that I'm trying to advance to, which is this space right here. It tells me the smallest number of ops card I can play, in this case 2 ops. If I played this card with 3 ops, that's valid. And it tells me what I have to roll. I have to roll a 1 to a 3. So I roll a die. I rolled a 1, so I get to advance to this space. How does advancing in the space race benefit you? Well, you're either going to get victory points, a special ability, or both. If you look at the numbers here, these tell you the number of victory points you get if there are any there. And the first one is the number of victory points the first person who gets here gets. The second number is the number of victory points the second person to get there gets. So since I'm the first one here, I would get 2 victory points. So I'd move the victory point marker 2 spaces in favor of the US. And later on, when the USSR player advances to this space, he would also get victory points, but he'd only get 1 because he was the second person there. Now for the majority of these spaces, you're either going to get victory points or a special ability. For the last space, you do get both victory points and a special ability. Now normally you can only play 1 card for the ops value on the space race, only 1 per turn. And another benefit of the playing a card to the space race track is that the event, if it's associated with your opponent, doesn't happen. With the other ways of playing your ops points, remember, if the event is associated with your opponent, it's triggered either before or after you play the ops points. But if you play a card for the ops points to the space race track, then if the event is associated with your opponent, it doesn't fire. So the space race track is really your safety valve for when you have a card in your hand with an opponent's event on it that you really don't want to happen. You can play that card to the space race track, but remember, you can only do that 1 time per turn, so choose wisely. Let's take a look at some of the special abilities you get. So if I moved on to the next space later on, I don't get any victory points, but I get the special ability that I get to play 2 space race cards per turn instead of 1. This special ability means that your opponent has to choose and show their headline event card first. Remember, normally in a headline event, it's the one with the higher ops value that goes first, but if you've advanced far enough, then they have to choose and show theirs first. This special ability, you get to discard 1 held card. So at the end of a turn, when you have that some cards left in your hand, you can now use this special ability to get rid of them. Say one of them has one of your opponent's events on it. And the last special ability is you may take 8 action rounds per turn instead of the regular 6 or 7. Now these special abilities are cumulative, so if I manage this to advance this far without the Soviet Union player advancing any, then I get both of these special events. I can both place 2 space race cards per turn, and my opponent has to choose and show their headline event card first. But once the USSR player manages to advance to this space, that thereby cancels that special power, and it's no longer available to anyone. So the benefits of trying to advance on the space race track are you do get a few victory points and some special abilities, but really the main benefit of the space race track is being able to dump one of your opponent event cards on it without triggering it. So those are the 4 alternatives you have for playing a card and spending its operations points. You must spend them all in one of those 4. You can't spread them out. So you either spend them for placing influence, attempting a realignment, attempting a coup, or playing to the space race. If you don't want to play a card for the ops value, then you would play it as an event. So let's take a look at the event to wrap up a few things that I didn't bring up in the headline phase. Now remember, with events, if there's an asterisk beside the event, it's removed from the game completely after the event is played. If the event is underlined, then it remains in effect for the remainder of the game until some other event cancels it. Other events modify operation point values for your opponent for the rest of the turn. For example, the Red Scare Purge says all further operation cards played by your opponent this turn are -1 to their op value to a minimum of 1 op value. That applies for all 4 alternatives of operations. So if I were to play this card, then whenever my opponent uses ops either for placing influence, realigning, coup attempts, or on the space race, they get 1 fewer operation point from that card. There are 5 special war cards in the game: the Indo-Pakistani War, the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli War, the Brush War, and the Iran-Iraq War. All of these war cards have pretty detailed event descriptions, but what I wanted to bring out was that when you play these cards as events, you also get points on your required military operations track. The USSR player for the Korean War and the Arab-Israeli War, and then whichever player played it for the other war cards. So after all the action rounds have been played for this turn, you move on to the next phase of the turn, which is to check the military operations status. Throughout the action rounds, you're going to be required to complete a number of military operations during the turn. The number you have to complete is going to vary based upon what the DEFCON status level is. After all action rounds in this example, the DEFCON status level is at 4. So that's the number of required military operations that you would have been required to make. In this case, the United States has met that requirement and completed 4 military operations. Remember, that was from spending 4 operation points to attempt a coup. So you get military operation points by spending op points from your cards to attempt coups. You also get military operation points when you play one of those war cards. So in this example, the U.S. has met the required military operations of 4, which is the current DEFCON status level, but the USSR has not. So in this example, the U.S. wouldn't lose any points, but the USSR would lose points equal to the difference. So 4 minus 0 is 4, so the USSR loses 4 points, which essentially means the United States gains 4 points. So the United States would move up 4 points on the victory track. If the United States were here and USSR were here, and the DEFCON status was at 4, the U.S. would lose 1 point because it's 1 point away from the DEFCON status level on the military ops track, so the USSR gains that point. But the USSR loses 3 points, 4 minus 1, so the net effect is that the U.S. gains 2 points on the victory track. So after you check military operations status, the next step is really for tournament play only. It's an optional rule that says to reveal the held card. This is really just an honesty check, just to verify that you're not holding a scoring card from turn to turn. The next step in a turn is to flip the China card. So let's talk a little bit more about the China card. Remember that the China card starts face up with the USSR player. The China card is worth 4 operation points, and those operation points can be used for any of the 4 alternatives we talked about earlier. You do get +1 operation value if you use all of the points in Asia. So if you use all of the points in Asia, this card is really worth 5 operational points. And the other special ability about this card is that if you make it all the way to the end of turn 10, whoever holds this card is going to get a +1 victory point bonus. So the China card starts in the possession of the USSR player, and the USSR player can choose to play it whenever he or she likes. The China card does not count towards the hand limit, and playing the China card is one of your actions during one of the action rounds. It's played instead of a card from your hand. So if you play the China card, then you're probably going to have more than a card left in your hand at the end of a turn. After you play it, you're going to pass it to your opponent face down. So whenever the USSR player decides to play the China card, he'll hand it over to the US player face down. The China card cannot be played when it's face down. So after you check military operation status and optionally reveal the held card, you're going to flip the China card. So what this essentially means is that the China card can only be played once per turn. The China card can never be played as a headline event, and it can never be played if it prevents you from playing scoring cards. And finally, the China card can never be played as a discard required by an event. So after all of this has happened, you're going to advance the turn marker and do it all again. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the DEFCON status track. Remember that the DEFCON status track is going to measure nuclear tension throughout the game. If it's at level 5, there is peace. You have the coup and realignment attempt restrictions if it's at levels 4, 3, or 2. And if it ever gets down to level 1, then nuclear war breaks out and the game is going to end immediately. We've seen some ways that the DEFCON status can change so far. For example, at the beginning of each turn, the DEFCON status is going to increase by 1. It can decrease, for example, if you attempt a coup in a battleground country, then it will decrease by 1. It can also be changed by certain events. And remember I said if the DEFCON status ever gets to 1, then nuclear war breaks out and the game ends. And whichever player played the event or card that caused nuclear war to break out loses the game immediately. The classic example of this is, let's say the DEFCON status is at level 2. The United States player plays the Olympic Games card as an event. The Olympic Games card says that the player, the United States, is sponsoring the Olympics. The opponent may participate or boycott. If the opponent participates, each player rolls 1 die, with the sponsor adding 2 to his roll, and the higher roll gains 2 victory points. Reroll ties. However, if the opponent boycotts, degrade the DEFCON status 1 level, and the sponsor may conduct operations as if they played a 4-ops card. The key phrase here is that if the opponent boycotts, DEFCON is degraded 1 level. If the United States played this card and the USSR decides to boycott the games, the DEFCON status drops 1 level into nuclear war. And since the United States played the card and is the phasing player, caused nuclear war to break out, the United States immediately loses the game. So it's very important to keep an eye on the DEFCON level and what impact it might have on certain event cards that are played. Now just to revisit the victory point track a little bit, the victory point track ranges from a USSR 20 to a US 20. You're going to start the game right in the middle in total equilibrium at 0. Whenever a player gains points, you move the victory point marker that many points in the direction of who won the points. So when the US gains 2 points, you move it 2 spaces towards the US. If the USSR would gain 5 points, you would move it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces towards the USSR side. When both players gain victory points, then only the difference is awarded to the player who won positive points. So throughout the game so far, we've seen a couple of ways that players gain victory points, such as when events give you direct victory points. Another way is when a player fails to conduct the required number of military operations. But one of the crucial ways of getting points is through regional scoring. So let's take a look at regional scoring now. So let's say that we're at the start of a turn in the mid-war, and this is the hand of cards that is dealt to the USSR player. The USSR player sees that he's got a Central America scoring card in his hand. And remember that scoring cards must be played during that turn and cannot be held until the next turn. This is the current situation in Central America, and so the USSR player knows that he needs to concentrate on spreading as much of his influence in Central America to get the most points when he plays the Central America scoring card. Let's say that through several actions he's able to accomplish controlling the Dominican Republic, controlling Haiti, keeping control of Cuba, but the United States comes in and controls Guatemala. So this is the current state of influence in Central America, and the USSR player decides to play the Central America scoring card. When the Central America scoring card is played, the Central American region is going to be scored based on relative influence between the two players. If you look at the regional scoring box for Central America, there are 3 levels of influence. There's presence, domination, and control. And this is the same for all the other regions. But the point values for the different levels are different. But for Central America, if you have presence, you get 1 point. If you have domination, you get 3 points. And if you have control of the region, you get 5 points. So what does each of these levels mean? Well, to have presence and get 1 point, you need to control at least 1 country in the region. To get to the domination level, you have to control more countries than your opponent in the region, and you have to control more battleground countries in the region, and you have to control at least 1 battleground and 1 non-battleground country. Finally, to have control of a region, you have to control more countries than your opponent, and you have to control all battleground countries. So each player is going to look at the levels and see which is the highest level they can obtain. So let's look at the USSR player first. Does the USSR player have presence in Central America? That means, does the USSR control at least one country in the region? The answer is yes, they control 3 countries. So we look at the next level, domination. Does the USSR dominate Central America? Do they control more countries than their opponent? Yes, the USSR controls 3 countries, the US only controls 1 country. Do they control more battleground countries? And the answer is yes, the USSR controls the battleground country of Cuba. The US does not control any battleground countries. They do have one influence in Panama, which is a battleground country, but that's not enough to control it. And finally, the third requirement for domination is, do you control at least one battleground and one non-battleground? The USSR controls the battleground of Cuba and the non-battleground of either Haiti or the Dominican Republic. So the USSR meets the qualifications of domination. What about control? Does the USSR control more countries than the United States and Central America? Yes, but the second qualification of control is what gets them. The USSR does not control all of the battleground countries. So the highest level of influence the USSR can manage right now is domination. So currently the USSR gets 3 points for dominating Central America. Now you also get bonus points. You get +1 for each country that you control that's adjacent to the enemy superpower. The USSR controls Cuba, which is adjacent to the enemy superpower United States, so they get +1 bonus point for that. So that brings them up to 4 points. And you also get +1 point for each battleground country you control. They do control 1 battleground country, Cuba, so that's another 1 bonus point for a total of 5 points. So that's the USSR score for Central America scoring. Now let's take a look at the United States. Does the United States have presence in Central America? Do they control at least 1 country in the region? Yes, they control Guatemala. What about domination? Do they control more countries than their opponent in the region? No. So immediately you know that the United States does not dominate Central America. They can only manage presence in Central America. So they're only going to get 1 point for the regional scoring so far. What about the bonus points? Do they control a country that's adjacent to the enemy superpower? Well, the enemy superpower is nowhere close to Central America, so no. Do they get +1 for any battleground countries that they control? No. The only country the United States controls is Guatemala, which is not a battleground country. So the United States does not get any bonus points. So the United States only gets 1 point from the regional scoring. So we've calculated the relative scores for the regional scoring of Central America. The USSR managed 5 points, the United States managed 1 point. So the net effect is that the USSR gets 4 points. So the victory point marker will move 4 points in the USSR's favor. All of the regions score in a similar fashion as that, except for the Southeast Asia scoring card. The Southeast Asia sub-region is scored a bit differently. Instead of looking at the different levels of presence, domination, and control, you simply get 1 victory point each for control of the countries in the Southeast Asia region, except for 2 victory points if you control Thailand. The other unique thing about the Southeast Asia scoring card is that it has an asterisk beside it, which means it's going to go out of the game once it's played. So it can only be, this sub-region can only be scored once in the entire game, and then it will no longer be scored again. The other region scoring cards will go into the discard pile, and it's possible that they can be scored again later in the game. So if the region scoring cards are going to come out at various points in the game, how do you know which regions to concentrate your efforts in? Well, one of the hints I can give you is that the game comes with a reference sheet. On one side is a reference for things like realignment rolls, coups, and how to do all that. And on the other side, you get a card manifest grouped by the early war, mid-war, and late war, along with the ops value and which side it favors. If you look in this list for the 0 value ops cards, those are the scoring cards. And you'll notice something interesting is that Asian scoring, Europe scoring, and Mideast scoring are in the early war. And then if you look down in the mid-war, you'll find that the Central America and Southeast Asia scoring cards don't come up until the mid-war. So early in the game, you'll probably be concentrating on Asia, Europe, and the Mideast, because you know those scoring cards are going to come out within the first 3 turns. And the Central America and Southeast Asia regions are not going to have potential for scoring until at least the mid-war. But again, all of the regional scoring cards except for Southeast Asia can be recycled through the discard pile, which can be reshuffled back into the draw pile, so regions can be rescored later on. So although there's not absolute certainty, part of the fun is figuring out when these region scoring cards are going to come out, and playing your influence appropriately and playing the scoring cards at the most opportune time to get the most points in regional scoring. Now remember I said that the overall game is going to last at most 10 turns. And I also said that most oftentimes it's going to end before that. So what are the ways that the game can end before you reach turn 10? On the victory point track, if you manage to get the victory point marker all the way to the 20 mark on your side of the victory point track, you immediately win the game. So if the USSR managed to get 20 victory points by turn 6, the game would immediately end and the USSR would win the game. Similarly, if the United States managed to get down to 20 victory points on their end, the game would immediately end and the United States would be victorious. The other way the game can end before turn 10 is by the play of the Europe scoring card. When the Europe scoring card is played, Europe is scored just like the example I gave with Central America scoring. But if someone manages control of Europe when the Europe scoring card is played, that person that controls Europe immediately wins the game. Europe was a crucial region to the Cold War, and that's how it comes out in the game, is that if you control Europe, when you score the European region, then you win the game. The final way the game can end before turn 10 is if someone causes the DEFCON status level to go to level 1. Remember the example of the Olympic Games card. In that case, the phasing player or the player that played the card and caused nuclear war would lose the game and the game ends immediately. But if none of those happen before turn 10, if neither side is able to get 20 victory points in their favor, DEFCON has not reached level 1, and no one has been able to control Europe when the Europe scoring card is played, then it is possible for the game to last 10 turns. If that happens, then at the end of turn 10, you have final scoring. In final scoring, every region is scored as if the scoring card for that region were played. And that's except for the Southeast Asia region. The Southeast Asia region is scored as part of the Asia region. So you go through each and every region and pretend the scoring card was played for that region. And you see what level of presence, domination of control each side can manage. You award victory points. And if in the middle of this regional scoring, if someone reaches 20 in their favor, the game doesn't immediately end. You have to score all regions and come up with the final location of the victory point marker. However, at final scoring, where you're scoring each and every region, if someone controls Europe at the end of the game does immediately end, and the player that controls Europe at the end of the game wins the game. However, if that's not the case, then you look at where the victory point marker ends up, and whichever side it's on, in this case it's on the US side, then that side wins. So the United States would win in this case. If the victory point marker ends up on the 0 start space, then the game is a draw. And so that is Twilight Struggle. So what do I think about Twilight Struggle? Well, as far as the components go, I really like the board. It's nice and large, it's quite colorful, it's very well organized with the different tracks, so it's very easy to keep track of the flow of the game. It's very easy to see the different regions and the countries and how they're connected. But the only thing I would caution you about is in Europe, looking at the difference between Western and Eastern Europe. Some countries like Canada and other countries, you have to really be careful about, is it a dark purple or a light purple, or is it in Western or Eastern Europe. But overall, I really like the board. It's very well laid out. You do get a lot of markers with the game in various denominations, and they hold up well to repeated play. I don't see much fraying there, but they do come in a number of denominations, so although you may have some stacking of markers, you're usually only have one marker in a given country at a time, so the potential for fiddliness there with the chits, it's not that bad really. As far as the cards go, I think they hold up pretty well to repeated play. The only issue I have is that with the nature of the game, the early war cards are going to see a lot more play and wear on them than the late war cards. When you start mixing them up, there could be a small problem there with cards with different wear levels. The rules, I think, are pretty good overall. It's very detailed. There are a lot of examples. There is quite a bit of cross-referencing between the rules, so you have to flip back and forth to get the full picture on certain parts of the game. The only real issue I have with the rules is with regional scoring. Regional scoring is a pretty vital part of the game in scoring points. And I don't think it's very clear and straightforward in the rules as to how regional scoring works. For example, in the first couple of games I played of Twilight Struggle, I played that the levels of scoring in the regional scoring, the presence, the domination, and control were cumulative. So if I managed to get domination, I'll get both points for presence and domination. But that's not how it works. You just get the highest level that you manage. And I don't think that was very straightforward in the actual rules. There is an example right there in the regional scoring section of the rules that makes it pretty clear, but I just wish the rules itself would have been more clear and more straightforward in how regional scoring works. The rules also come with some reference sheets, and I really like those to help remind me of the way the different ways of using ops points works, the realignment rolls, the coup attempts, the space race, etc. And also like the manifest on the back where you can see when the regional scoring cards are going to come out, as well as what other cards are out there, what their point values are, which side they benefit, etc. And also on the reference sheet is a nice quick setup reference. And that brings me to the setup of the game. I think the game setup is very quickly, you're just placing very minimum of starting influence, and you just deal out the cards and you're ready to go. So what about the flow of play? Twilight Struggle is a very complex and strategic game. There are a lot of mechanisms going on at the same time. In your hand of cards, you have to think about, is it going to be more advantageous for me to play this card for the ops points or for the event? And for those cards that have your opponent's event on them that are going to fire if you play the ops points, are you going to be able to mitigate the effects of your opponent's events with your ops points, or would it be beneficial for you to dump it on the space race, for example? You also have to think about all the different regions on the board that are in play. Which region are you going to concentrate your efforts in? How reactive are you going to be to your opponent's placement of their influence, etc. Also, DEFCON. You have to constantly look at what's the current DEFCON level, and how does that affect for example, my coup attempts and my realignment attempts in the various regions. Also, DEFCON is a very subtle strategic tool in the game, and we saw an example of that, and so that's another tool you could use for winning the game early if you're able to manage the DEFCON level in the right way, so that maybe your opponent can cause nuclear war and you would thereby win the game. You also have to keep an eye on your required military ops that you have to do at each turn. And so as you can see, there's a lot of different things going on at the same time within the game, and these mechanisms are all interacting with each other, and you have to constantly be aware and mindful of how they are affecting the game. Twilight Struggle is not a balanced game throughout the course of the game. What I mean by that is, in the early war, there are a lot of more cards that are beneficial to the USSR player, and so the USSR player is going to be stronger earlier in the game. And so unless you have a US player who knows that and knows how to mitigate the harmful effects of those USSR events, the game could end quite quickly. And that brings me to my next point, is that this game, it really is suited for two players at similar experience levels. You know, if you have a newbie to the game playing with a very experienced player who knows all of these mechanisms and how the USSR player is stronger early on, then it could be a very uneven and quick game. But it works really well if you have two players of equal experience level, or maybe two newbies that grow with the game and learn all of these strategies and how best to play the cards, etc. But another positive point of having so many mechanisms going on in the game is that it really fits within the theme of the game, which is the Cold War and the tension between the two sides. So there's always that back and forth between the two sides. As far as replayability, I think this game is highly replayable. You know, you may have a game that ends very quickly, and you can look at why did it end quickly, or what strategies did I employ that worked and which ones didn't work. And you always get the feeling that you want to go back and try something new or try it a different way. So I think the replayability of this game is really high. So my personal review is I really like the game. I like the component quality. I like the flow of play of the game, all the different mechanisms. I like constantly thinking about how all these things are coming together to affect the game. And I always want to come back and play the game again and try different strategies and different ways of trying to win the game. So I really like the game. It's probably in my top 10 games. But would it be a game that you would enjoy? Well, that brings me to decision points. So how can I help you decide if Twilight Struggle would be a game that would interest you? I think it boils down to really 4 questions you can ask yourself. Do you have an interest in a card-driven political war game about the Cold War? If you answered yes, then I think you would enjoy Twilight Struggle. If you have no interest in card-driven games of this type, or the Cold War seems really dry and boring to you, Twilight Struggle may not be the game for you. The second question I would ask myself is, do I like a game with a lot of moving parts that's kind of complex, and I'm constantly having to think about how all of the moving parts are playing together to affect the game? If you answer yes, then Twilight Struggle may be right for you. If you like a more simpler game where you're just concentrating on just a few things at any one time, Twilight Struggle is probably not the game for you, because there are so many different moving parts and mechanisms in the game. The third question I would ask myself is, can I have patience with the game and play it a number of times before I really get the understand the game as a whole and sort of be able to develop a strategy to successfully win the game? If you can't have that kind of patience with a game, then Twilight Struggle may be right for you. But if you want to be able to get in the game on the first play and sort of quickly see how it works and understand the game and be able to do well at it early on, Twilight Struggle is probably not right for you. And finally, the fourth question I would ask myself is, consider the gaming group, who you play games with. This is a two-player game, so do you mostly just play with one other person, or do you mostly play with a larger gaming group? If you mostly play with a larger gaming group, then this game may not be worth it, because it may not see a lot of playtime. But if you mostly play games with one other person, then Twilight Struggle would probably be a good fit for you and see a good amount of playtime. So ask yourself these 4 questions. Do you have an interest in a card-driven political war game about the Cold War? Do you like a game with a lot of moving parts, a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking going on? Do you have the patience to play a number of games of Twilight Struggle before you sort of get how everything works together and are able to play well at it? And finally, do you mostly play 2-player games? If you answer yes to all 4 questions, then I can pretty much guarantee you that Twilight Struggle would be really enjoyable for you, and if you haven't played it already or checked it out, you should definitely go out and pick it up and give it a try. So that does it for this episode of Board Game Review with Jason. If you enjoyed this episode and want to watch some of my other episodes, you can go on YouTube at BGRWJ, and all my other videos are there. Also be sure to subscribe there so you can be notified when future videos come out. You can also find my main blog at boardgamereviewwithjason.blogspot.com. All my videos are posted there as well, also with some links to other sites, other reviews of the game, other resources you can go and download for the game to maybe help you out, such as player aids, etc. You can also like the Facebook page. Just go search for Board Game Review with Jason, like that, interact with other viewers of Board Game Review with Jason, post comments about the episodes. And I'd really like to hear your feedback on Board Game Review with Jason, not just this episode, but my other episodes as well. Were they helpful for you in learning the game? Did they convince you to go out and try a game? How did that go? Was it a good fit for your gaming group? So if you have feedback on these episodes, you can comment on those various sites or send me an email at boardgamereviewwithjason@gmail.com. On the blog, there's also a donate button that you can donate to the show securely through PayPal, and any amount you wish to donate to help support the show does give me a lot of encouragement to keep producing these shows. So if you feel like doing so, I'd really appreciate it. But that does it for this episode of Board Game Review with Jason, so I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.